Somewhere in the peaceful town of Blackwater, Ontario, lay an ancient building surrounded by dense forest and mist, known only as the Palace of Shadows. It was a place children whispered about, a place adults warned against. The locals would share hushed stories of those who ventured too close, only to return with haunted expressions, or sometimes not at all. They said the palace was home to something old and restless, something that didn't want to be disturbed. For as long as she could remember, Ella had heard stories about the palace. She was a brave and curious teenager, always the first to volunteer for the spooky challenges her friends would come up with. But even she had her limits when it came to Blackwater's haunted secrets. Yet, the night before Halloween, her friends convinced her to go. "Come on, Ella, aren't you even a little curious?" laughed her best friend, Chloe, nudging her. "Just think about it. Nobody from school has ever dared to actually go inside. We'll be the first." Ella rolled her eyes but couldn't deny the thrill creeping up her spine. "All right, I'm in," she said finally. "But we're not staying long, okay?" The group of friends gathered by the edge of the forest just as the sun set, casting eerie shadows over the trees. Their flashlights barely pierced through the thick fog that rolled over the ground. They took a deep breath and stepped into the forest, with Ella leading the way. Entering the palace, the forest was silent, their footsteps the only sound against the wet leaves. The deeper they went, the darker it became, until even the moonlight seemed swallowed by the trees. Finally, they saw it, the palace, looming up ahead. It was massive, its once beautiful stonework cracked and overgrown with ivy. Towers rose high above them, windows shattered and walls scarred by time. "Who would build something like this all the way out here?" whispered Oliver, Chloe's cousin and the most skeptical of the group. "Someone who didn't want it to be found," Chloe replied, her voice barely a whisper. They crossed the threshold, the heavy creaking doors opening as if they'd been waiting. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and mold. Long-forgotten portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring down with ghostly eyes. A grand staircase wound up to the second floor, its steps worn from decades of neglect. The floor was littered with old newspaper clippings and broken furniture. As they wandered through the shadowed hallways, Chloe picked up an old newspaper. The headline caught her eye: "Tragic accident in Blackwater Palace leaves family devastated." The article was faded, but she could make out bits and pieces. It seemed the family who once lived there had suffered a terrible fate. "Do you think this is why people say it's haunted?" Chloe asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Maybe," Ella replied, glancing around, "but I have a feeling there's more to it than that." A mysterious sound. Just then, a faint sound echoed through the palace. It was like a soft hum, almost musical, coming from somewhere deep within the building. They exchanged uneasy glances. Ella's curiosity got the better of her, and she started down a dark hallway, her friends close behind. As they approached the source of the sound, they realized it was a music box. The haunting melody drifted through the air, growing louder with every step. Finally, they found it. A small, intricately carved box lying on a table, covered in dust. Oliver reached out to open it, but Ella grabbed his hand. "Don't touch it," she warned. "It could be cursed or something." Oliver laughed, but he didn't try to touch it again. Instead, they listened to the music until it faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. That was when they heard a new sound, footsteps coming from the floor above. "Did you hear that?" whispered Chloe, clutching Ella's arm. "Let's check it out," Ella said, feeling both terrified and excited. They climbed the staircase, each step creaking under their weight. At the top, they found themselves in a long hallway lined with doors. One door stood slightly ajar, and from inside, they could see a dim light flickering. They cautiously approached, peering through the crack. Inside was a large bedroom, the walls covered in faded wallpaper and old photographs. A single candle burned on the nightstand, casting a flickering glow over the room. And then they saw her, a woman in a pale dress, sitting by the window, her back to them. She was humming softly, the same melody from the music box. The friends froze, hearts pounding. They knew they should leave, but they were too captivated to move. "Excuse me?" Ella whispered, barely audible. The woman stopped humming, her head tilting slightly as if she'd heard something, but she didn't turn around. "Let's go," Oliver hissed, tugging on Ella's arm. but before they could move, the woman spoke. He said he would return, but he never did. Her voice was soft, filled with sadness and longing. She sounded like she was talking to herself, lost in a memory. Ella felt a pang of sympathy for her, even though she was clearly not alive. The woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I waited for him, night after night, until the candle burned out, and now I am trapped here, waiting forever. The legend of the lady in the palace. Back in town, they had heard whispers of the lady in the palace, a ghostly figure who waited for her lost love to return. Some said she had been a young woman whose fiancé had gone off to war and never returned. Others claimed she had been the wife of the palace's owner, left alone after his tragic death. But all the stories agreed on one thing. She was doomed to wait for eternity. We have to help her, Ella said, surprising herself. How? Oliver asked. She's a ghost. What can we do? But Ella was determined. There must be something keeping her here, some way to break the curse. They spent the next few hours searching the palace for clues, trying to piece together the mystery. They found old letters, photographs, and even a journal, all hinting at a tragic love story. It seemed that the woman had been waiting for a man named Edward, who had promised to return but never did. Finally, they found a small locket hidden in a drawer, engraved with the initials E and L. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of the woman and her lost love. Ella felt a strange sense of connection to her, as if she understood her pain. We have to bring this to her, Ella said, clutching the locket tightly. Confronting the lady in the palace, they returned to the woman's room, where she still sat by the window, staring into the darkness. Ella took a deep breath and held out the locket. This is for you, she said softly. The woman turned, her face pale and hauntingly beautiful. She looked at the locket, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Slowly she reached out, her ghostly fingers brushing against Ella's hand. He kept it all this time, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Ella nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what the woman meant. Somehow she knew that this was what the woman needed to move on, to finally find peace. The woman smiled, a bittersweet expression that seemed to lift the weight of centuries from her shoulders. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible. Thank you for helping me remember. As she spoke, her form began to fade, the edges blurring until she was nothing more than a whisper of light. And then she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of roses in the air. The palace awakens. The moment the woman disappeared, the palace seemed to shift. The shadows lifted, the air grew warmer, and the eerie silence was replaced by the soft sound of birds singing outside. It was as if the building itself had been freed from a spell. The friends stood in awe, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over them. We did it, Ella said, smiling at her friends. We actually helped her. They left the palace feeling lighter than when they had arrived. As they stepped into the forest, they glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the woman watching them from the window. But the palace was empty, its haunted past finally laid to rest. A new beginning. Back in town, the friends couldn't stop talking about their adventure. They shared their story with the locals, who listened in disbelief. Over time, the tales of the Palace of Shadows began to fade, replaced by stories of bravery and friendship. Ella would never forget the lady in the palace and the sadness in her eyes. She felt honored to have helped her find peace, to have played a small part in ending a centuries-old curse. And though she knew she'd never return to the palace, she couldn't help but smile every time she thought of it. A place that had once been filled with darkness, now finally at rest. Epilogue: The Legacy of the Lady in the Palace. Years later, people still talked about the night the lady in the palace found peace. Some said,